Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Bennington with the Circle of Atonement, and I'm here with Circle founder Robert Perry. And today we are discussing one of the most important questions for all course students. And that question is, was Helen's editing guided? If you are new to this work, or if you just need a refresher, A Course in Miracles was scribed from 1965 to 1972. Through a process of inner dictation by a New York psychologist named Helen Schucman from an author she believed and we believe to be Jesus. The course was published in 1976 by the Foundation for Inner Peace, and the preface included a part written by Helen herself that said, quote, "Only a few minor changes have been made between what was in her original scribal notes and what was published in book form." And that was that. Students believed that Helen's preface was the final word until 1991, when Ken Wapnick's book, Absence from Felicity, came out. Now, Ken, as many of you know, I'm sure, was part of the original four that brought the course into the world. This was a group that included Helen, her co-scribe Bill Thetford, Judy Scutch, and Ken himself. And so Ken was part of the course's story from the very beginning. Ken knew Helen very well. She considered him to be a dear friend, almost like a spiritual son. And Absence from Felicity is Ken's account of the scribing of the course. And in that book, Ken included thousands of words that Helen took down that weren't included in the Foundation for Inner Peace edition of A Course in Miracles. And so this was very intriguing and very puzzling to course students who were wondering what else was out there that we didn't know about. And then it gets even more interesting because 9 years later, in year 2000, earlier drafts of the course started to appear on the internet. And we realized that there was indeed far more editing done to the published version of the course than we were originally told. And this is where things get even more complicated, because now the issue becomes how much of the original material should we be privy to as students? What is meant to be included in the course proper and what isn't? Who gets to make that decision about what's included and what's not, and why? And this is not a small matter, because the way that you answer these questions as a student is bedrock to your experience of this path. These are questions that can determine what edition of the course that you read, how much information you have access to, and ultimately how much you learn from the material and allow yourself to be transformed by it. Here at the Circle, we publish the complete and annotated edition of A Course in Miracles, which we call the CE for short. We'll get into the journey of the CE in just a moment. But the reason it was published is because the Circle, and specifically you, Robert, felt that if Jesus is the author of the course, if this really is Jesus, then these are immortal words of the greatest historical significance. And because of that, everyone should have access to them, everyone without exception. But as we have learned, there are some who don't feel this way. And so we've decided to talk about it in the podcast today. And as a bit of a disclaimer, I'll say here from the beginning what we always say here at the Circle, and it's that the main teachings of the course are the same in every edition. So there is no right or wrong edition of the course to choose from, but there are many different editions to choose from, and there are considerable differences between them. And so our discussion today is meant to help you understand why that is, how it happened, and what to make of it all. So, Robert, is there anything that you want to say about this topic before we launch in?
No, I really like your introduction. It's a big topic. You know, we don't want to somehow say that the differences between the editions are, you know, ultimately different. The teachings are the same, but people do experience the additions differently. And this issue that we're dealing with today is a big issue for students.
Yeah, as I said, it's bedrock. It really is a determinant of again, how much information you have access to and what you allow in and how it can transform your path. So Robert, you've been a course student since 1981. You just celebrated your 40th anniversary with the course last year. And so you were basically part of the first wave of students who felt the original publication of the course was unedited, right?
Yes, that was certainly the impression we had. There were these things you heard that Helen got, what I always assumed were just like isolated comments about Freud and about Carl Jung. But the impression I had, and I believe this was shared by other course students, was that we had pretty much all of it in the pages of A Course in Miracles.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, and that was the message we were getting. I mean, in the preface to the course, it said exactly what you said. Only a few minor changes have been made. The material is substantially unchanged. Bill Thetford did an interview in which he was asked if there was editing done, and he just flatly said no. And in recent years, an interview has surfaced with Helen Schucman herself, which we'd like to play a little snippet from, because you see how she handles the question. And this is exactly, what we all were thinking. This is just a portion of that interview.
What year did Helen do this interview?
Good question. I don't really know.
Okay.
That's all I can really say about it.
Tried to edit it at times, didn't you?
Yes, I did. It would bother me, and I would never forget what it was originally, and I would feel kind of uneasy about it. But since I do so much editing, I figured, well, I'm improving this, and that's it. But then later, when it would pick it up again and refer back to that, then it would be inconsistent because it would use the original word. So then I very quickly learned, don't do that, because you will interfere with the internal consistency. So then I stopped doing that. Very quickly I learned that that was a very bad mistake. So we went back and we changed all the words back into its original form.
So we went back and we changed all of the words back to the original form.
Right. And she said she learned very quickly that was a bad mistake. So this was part of the romance of the story. Like her ego wanted to edit it and tried to, but then she realized that would mess with very exacting language. And she learned it was a very bad mistake, to quote what she just said. And she went back and changed it all back to the original wording.
Right. So in the preface, as I think you may have just mentioned, she said only a few minor changes have been made, chapter titles, subheadings. There were personal references that have been omitted, but otherwise the material is substantially unchanged. And then Bill contributed to this perspective as well, as you were saying.
Yeah, so he was asked a direct question in a magazine interview about editing, and he said, no, you and Helen. He was asked if he and Helen edited the course, and he said no.
So students believed, based on what Helen and Bill were saying and what Helen had written in the preface, that the editing to the course was minimal. But then when it became clear that the editing to the course was substantial, the story changed. And so can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So for many students and teachers, what grew up was not, oh, thank goodness there was no editing. It was, well, yes, there was editing, but it was exactly the way it should be. So for instance, there's the idea that that reading the material that was taken out of the course is kind of like reading Helen's personal diary. Why do we feel the right to read her personal diary? Which is an odd defense.
Well, yeah, because if this is Jesus, if we really believe that this is Jesus, then wouldn't we want to know, and aren't we entitled to know all that he has to say?
Right.
Every
this
word.
Is not just her personal diary. We've benefited for 2,000 years from records in the Gospels of things Jesus said to particular individuals.
Yeah. And even if it was her personal diary, I feel like if this really is Jesus, then whatever it is that he had to say is something that we should all have access to.
Yeah, and then you also hear that, well, all the material that was taken out was what is sometimes called scribal error, where Helen's hearing was still rusty, she wasn't hearing right, so it was taken out for those reasons. We'll address that later. But the overall idea was that all of the editing, at least as the story goes, was absolutely right, proper. And indeed, I hear more and more these days, which I think is the reason why we're doing this. We hear increasingly that, well, all of that editing was guided. Mm-hmm. And from my standpoint, how do we know that? On what basis do we know that? Shouldn't we look to evidence rather than just this kind of blanket assumption that it was all guided?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard not to see the psychological need at work here. I mean, we really do we love the story of an inerrant scripture, and we kind of need it as students, don't you think?
We absolutely need it. We love to believe, if we've been reading a book for years and believe it's scripture, we want to believe it's straight from heaven. There's a line you hear Christians quote a lot from 2 Timothy that says, all scripture is God-breathed. My favorite story in this regard is about the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which took place more than 2,000 years ago. So the Hebrew Old Testament was translated into Greek, and the ruler who commissioned the translation, so the story goes, put 72 scholars from Jerusalem in separate rooms and had them translate the Hebrew Bible from memory, and all 72 of them translated the exact same thing. And that story, so they say, that story is the basis for the title of that translation. They called it the Septuagint, which means the 70, a reference to a story that is just about as fantastical as Santa Claus. It's not a believable story, but people want a story like that. Another story that comes to my mind is back in my church days, our pastor would tell the story where when the Revised Edition came out, which was a modernization and updating of the King James, so the story goes, a churchgoer said, well, if the King James was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. Of course, it was translated in 1611. Okay.
Right.
So there's just this overpowering need we have to tell ourselves a story, however thin and flimsy the story may be, that this scripture is absolutely God-breathed.
Yeah, I know. We really want that, and that's part of the appeal of the course. We really want our words to be sacrosanct and perfect. But just kind of moving on to the editing process of the course itself, that's a bit of a mystery to students. So what is it that we actually know about how the course was edited?
We know a lot because we have all but one of the versions that it went through, the editions it went through before publication. So let me take you through the process briefly. So first, Helen would take down her notes from Jesus, the words she received, on her shorthand notebook pages. And I mean, it's not all shorthand, but she took them down on shorthand pads. And she would do some editing on those pages. Okay. And then she'd read her notes to Bill, who would type them up. His typescript was what they called the urtext. And then once he typed them up, she would do as she read them, actually, she would do some editing, a little bit. And then once he typed them up, she would edit by hand on the typewritten pages. You can see the handwriting, and you can see it's her handwriting, okay? And then she undertook to retype the text herself, and Ken Wapnick called her retyping of it the second draft, and she edited as she went. And then she and Bill Thetford took that second draft and used it as the basis of producing what they called the Hugh Lynn version, or the Hugh Lynn Casey version. They gave a copy to Edgar Casey's son, Hugh Lynn, and they edited as they went. And then Helen and Ken Wapnick took the Hugh Lynn Casey version and they edited that to produce the FIP first edition, and they edited as they went.
Yeah, so you're saying they edited as they went, And so how many words came out of each draft as they went along?
Right, good question. It's important to note that most of what came out is in the first 4 chapters, and that tapers until you reach chapter 9, in which case very, very little comes out, okay? But as she read her notes, her handwritten notes to Bill, there's about 10,000 words she didn't read to Bill, okay? And then the text, as it went through the 2-phase process of going to the second draft and then going to the Hugh and Casey, 23,000 words came out of that. Probably about half of that in the first process, about half in the second process. And then as the Hugh and Casey was edited to produce the FIP first edition, another 12,000 words came out of that, for a total of 45,000 words, which is a small book. And there are a lot of issues to make note of in terms of the editing. First of all, like we're saying, every time she touched it, more and more came out. Also, more and more wording was changed. Even of the material that stayed in, a lot of wording changes were made, such that in the first 4 chapters, only 20% of the sentences that remained in retained their original wording.
That's
so
amazing.
Yeah.
I know that's a hard thing sometimes for people to comprehend, but of the sentences that remain, only 20% retained their original wording. And that's
right. So 4 out of 5 sentences had wording changes. And this is not punctuation or capitalization changes, it's wording changes. What you see is a clear desire to change the more informal and more specific and down-to-earth language into more abstract, more lofty language. As a result, the early chapters read more like the lofty, abstract later chapters than they would have without the editing.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of really important things to note from those processes that I described.
And we're going to go through, as we continue our discussion, into some of the more detailed edits that were made, just to give you some examples of what you found in the process of creating the CE. But one of the biggest observations that you've made, and Ken did confirm this with you personally as well, was that when they were editing new drafts of the course, they were only consulting the draft that came before. So in other words, as these new versions were being created, no one was going back to the original notes to check whether the edit that was being made matched the original notes. And so all of that language got lost in part because of that, right?
Well, yeah, and also, I mean, things got lost, and then original wording got lost as well. And this is something that I did have Ken confirm that to me, but it didn't need to be confirmed. You see it if you put things in parallel columns. Once you put things, the same passage as it appears in the notes, the text, the Helen Casey, the FIP first edition, once you see it side by side, you realize, oh, wait, once something, whether a word or a paragraph drops out, it never
comes back.
Never comes back in.
It never comes back.
Right. And it's
go ahead.
It's interesting, once he told them to check the text at least against the notes, acting like the notes were the touchstone. But there's no evidence that they did that actual checking against the notes. So there are other problems that occurred in the process, and we'll go through them now in some detail. First of all, there is a certain hastiness in the editing that happened. You can see it. Now, I realize that they did not have the benefit of computer search programs back then. They were just two people working on this. You can understand why they would work quickly, but you can see in many, many places that there was clearly a sort of a hastiness. So for instance, there were times where Bill would type a word in the urtext and he like maybe typed two letters on top of each other. So it's hard to know what the word was supposed to be, but they could have gone back and looked. So for instance, in one place that said that death is a human affirmation of a belief in hate, it got rendered a belief in fate because of the way Bill typed it in a garbled way. Another one talked about gods you hold more dear. You're reluctant to follow the practice instructions in the workbook only because of gods you hold more dear. Well, again, the typing was fuzzy and they rendered it as goals you hold more dear. But it then goes on to talking about you singing litanies to these goals. It makes more sense to sing litanies to gods. Right.
And the mistake between hate and fate didn't make it into the course. They caught that.
No, they didn't catch it. That whole line just got removed.
Oh, it was never in the course in the first place.
It was never in the FIP edition in the first place. They didn't go back and catch it. They just took out the line.
The one about goals you hold more dear did make it into the FIP. And so it's just an example of how when you get one word wrong, the whole meaning is changed.
Yeah. And there are tons of changes in meaning. I haven't tried to count, but it's so many. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes the editors clearly didn't understand what they were editing, which is understandable. The course is difficult to comprehend. Mm-hmm. But one example that's really, really undeniable is in the Hewlin Casey version, there's one footnote. And this footnote has to do with where the word spiritual eye occurs in the miracle principles. And the footnote says the term spiritual eye is later replaced by the Holy Spirit. And the physical eye becomes the ego. The emphasis on the two ways of seeing, however, remains. Well, the spiritual eye is never equated or replaced with the Holy Spirit. The spiritual eye, Jesus himself defines, he says the spiritual eye or true vision. The spiritual eye is the faculty in us that sees with true vision. That term is later replaced by the eyes of Christ, a very similar term. But on the basis...
Go ahead.
On the basis of this understanding that spiritual eye really was Holy Spirit, they changed it to Holy Spirit in those miracle principles where it occurs. And that was just a flat misunderstanding. Also, the physical eye becomes the ego, another misunderstanding.
Yeah, and in the Hewlin Casey version, there's one footnote that refers to this concept, and it's wrong.
Right. The only time they explained, unfortunately, they got it wrong.
The one footnote.
Yeah.
And it equates the spiritual eye with the Holy Spirit, and that was just
and
not
oddly
accurate.
enough, the spiritual eye is so clearly a faculty in us for seeing that in the chapter 2 references to the spiritual eye, they replaced it with things like spiritual sight.
Okay, so
not Holy Spirit.
I feel like we can.
Okay, we're in the weeds.
I know. We were saying before we hit record that the danger here was to get into the teachings and not sort of stay at the surface level of the editing. And here we go.
Here we go.
With that. But that is a fascinating thing, the spiritual eye and the Holy Spirit and that misunderstanding. A lot of students, it has affected a lot of students who have carried that view. Anyway, in addition to the editing instructions, both specific and general, that were sometimes not followed, there were instructions from Jesus to make specific edits that were sometimes not followed. So can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, specific instructions and general. So for instance, the big general instruction that was not followed was Jesus said that Bill should be in charge of decisions about, quote, what should be included in the written part of the course at all, or whether you should keep these notes separately. So Jesus knew there were certain things that were just too personal for the course itself. And Bill was in charge. He placed Bill in charge of those decisions. I think almost certainly because Helen lacked objectivity. She said she wanted to take out almost everything. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But it's pretty clear that Bill, in spite of the legend that's grown up in Course in Miracles circles, it's pretty clear Bill never assumed that role. Helen was really clearly the editor throughout. And there was a wisdom there. She admits she wanted to take everything out. Bill didn't. He didn't want to change things. So not following that instruction was kind of a big deal. But there were other instructions. In Principle 19, Helen took down miracles make souls one in Christ, no, in God. And Jesus said, change it to Christ. And they didn't do that. It reads in God to this day in the FIP edition. He said, leave in the part about cooperation in that same principle. And what it said was cooperation depends on miracles. But what they said was that miracles depend on cooperation. So they reversed the cause and effect.
Yeah.
Right. So there were editing instructions that were not followed, even though, many of them were.
So some things were just omitted. Sometimes editing instructions weren't followed, and sometimes they just made mistakes, just flat out mistakes. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and like I said earlier, there are many, many places where the meaning was changed. I don't think they add up to all that much. But our question here is, was Helen's editing guided? And if it was guided, you wouldn't expect the meaning to be changed as if the author had forgotten what he meant. The first thing I did when I got a hold of the urtext back in, I think, 2001, I was convinced that I thought there was very probably an editing mistake in Review 2 in the workbook, because you literally, no matter how hard you examined the instructions for Review 2, it was impossible to decide if you were supposed to do one longer practice period of 15 minutes or two longer practice periods. And I thought if there was an S at the end of the word ideas that was not there originally, then the whole thing made sense. It was 2, which was logical anyway, because you built up to 2 over the previous 2 weeks before that review. So sure enough, it says idea singular. There's another editing change they made in punctuation to make it read like it was supposed to be 1. So clearly they intentionally changed it to give the reader the impression it was 1, but it was 2. So
I'm laughing because you're probably the only student who's like itching to get a hold of the notes to figure out whether there's 1 practice period or 2.
But you've got 10 days. If you have 10 days where you don't do that second 15-minute practice period, that's like 2.5 hours of straight practice where you're listening for a message that you don't do. That's something. And then another one that we've touted. Did you want to go ahead? Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Another one we've touted is where he says in chapter 18, prepare you not, emphasis on not, for the undoing of what never was. And in the FIP edition, that became prepare you now, emphasis on now, for the undoing of what never was. Another one, there's so many. Originally, it said this course is a guide to behavior, being a very direct and very simple learning situation, et cetera, et cetera. And that became not this course is a guide to behavior, but this course offers a very direct and a very simple learning situation. Clearly, calling the course a guide to behavior was taken out. Changing the meaning.
And these things are massive, because how often do you hear as course students, well, this is not a course in behavior. And if your foundational attitude towards the book comes from a misinterpretation or just a mistake, then it affects everything. It affects how you behave in the world. And also, I just have to add this, were you going to say something about behavior?
Yeah, I just did want to say it. I mean, I'm sure it's intentional. In the editing process, that was the final one where Ken Wapnick was part of it, there was a new pattern in the editing, which was to take out references to behavior or to change them to references to thought. It wasn't done consistently, but it was done. There was a pattern of doing that. So this is part of that pattern.
Yeah, and also like on the prepare you not versus prepare you now example, I mean, I know you've always been really struck by that, and I've always considered it kind of okay, well, it's a mistake, no big deal. But when we had a conversation recently with John Mundy, he was like, well, hold on. I didn't know that that was a mistake. I've been doing sermons on prepare you not, or prepare you now rather, for the
Right.
undoing of what never was. And so, John has been doing sermons on this line in that was errant. And so
Right.
these things do matter. Even like one little word, one little letter in one little word,
Well,
now
do
versus
something
not.
not versus do something now is a difference.
It's a huge difference.
And there's no mystery about what was originally intended, because this follows on the section, and in the notes was not separate from the continuation of the section that's now called the little willingness, which has a huge focus on not trying to prepare yourself for the holy instant. So not preparing yourself has been a theme in the previous paragraphs right before this comment.
Right. And in lesson 155, you and I have talked about before, there's a line that says, now can the truth enter. And then in the FIP, it says, nor can the truth enter, or not can the truth enter. No,
nor can the
how does
truth
that
reach them through illusions.
Right. So the whole point is now the truth can reach you, and that one little change of nor means that it can't reach you. And so the whole meaning of the lesson, or the whole meaning of that sentence, is changed as a result.
There's a lot of meaning changes. They don't amount to a change in what the course teaches, but they definitely amount to a change in those places, of course.
I know. And I've got to go, and we said we wouldn't do this, but I know.
Don't do it.
I can't help myself.
Anyway.
But no, I want to say this because we just did this workshop. We just did this workshop on depression and anxiety in the course, and anxiety is coupled with the word separation, and in the FIP it's not. And so all you have in the notes, you have separation anxiety, which is a whole important teaching. And when you take separation away from anxiety, it's a completely different teaching.
Well, what the difference was that if you look at the pattern of comments in the course about anxiety, it's clear that the fundamental basis for that is anxiety about being separate from God and his guidance and protection and companionship and love. And there are 5 references in chapter 4 originally to the term separation anxiety, which has to do with a child's anxiety about being separate from the guidance and love and protection, etc., of its mother. And so those 5 references just captured his whole view on anxiety that you see throughout the course, but they took out all 5 references to separation anxiety, which is really unfortunate. Right. Anyway, we have to move on.
Well, in this workshop, sorry, I know we're going to get there, but in this workshop, we made one point about anxiety. 1 point. All, was it 60 or 40 references to anxiety, 40, built up to this 1 point that all anxiety is about separation anxiety. And if that word separation is uncoupled from anxiety, then you just miss it. And
the term is just taken out.
You miss what he's trying to teach you about this fundamental mental illness. Okay, so we're getting there. We're all right. So we've shared these examples.
Couple more things. One is that
now who's taking? Go ahead.
There's editing on top of editing.
Right.
So the same passage would get edited and then re-edited, and it would get shorter and shorter as it went. Like there's a passage that now in the FIP edition it's a miracle principle. It wasn't originally about miracles represent freedom from fear. That passage started out at 90 words, then it became 68 words, and finally it was just like 22 words. And a lot of passages were like that, which does not suggest a divine process. You can't imagine Jesus saying, you know what, now that I'm thinking about it again, can you re-edit that one? Another one is that you just see so many changes made that you think, you know what, that just didn't need to be made. It doesn't change the meaning. It just really didn't need to be made. It was originally, the language was just fine. The language is still just fine. why change it? It seems like someone felt too free.
Right. Yeah, and as a writer, I mean, we're both writers. Anyone who's a writer, like, you know, the temptation to keep monkeying with the work, but
Right.
Jesus clearly knew what he was doing because so much of the course is in perfect iambic pentameter. So now, what we've gone through so much of the editing process, what kind of picture can we form of the process overall?
Yeah. We have tens of thousands, if not more, editing decisions that Helen made in black and white on the pages of these different versions. As you go through those, you get an overall feel. And the feeling you get is this is a human product. You have someone here who is a good editor, who's trying to be faithful, but they're uncomfortable with the less formal, more concrete language in the early chapters. The editor wants them to read like the later chapters. This person doesn't like the topic of sex. It gets taken out more and more until it's just gone. It's someone who feels very free to change wording, to take things out, to relocate passages. 6,000 words were actually relocated.
On the topic of sex, when she was like, Helen actually said, "There will not be sex in my book." I mean, that
Yeah.
gives you some indication of the kind of freedom that she felt in the editing.
Anyway, so this person who is editing often doesn't understand what they're editing, but they can't seem to stop. It's like there's a program that runs. With every editing pass, the same stuff is done. More stuff's taken out. More wording is changed. It's like there's a process a program that just can't stop running.
Mm-hmm. So what does that tell us about Helen as an editor?
Well, first of all, it tells us that profile could be somebody else, but it so obviously is Helen. Ken Wapnick said she was a compulsive editor. She couldn't stop herself. He also said she was ashamed of the early chapters, their informality, their specificity. As you said, she said, according to Dr. Bob Rosenthal, who said, Bill told him this, she said, "I will not have sex in my course." And what we see here is a pattern in what we've just said. And I want to talk about other instances of this pattern because they're very, very illuminating. This is perhaps the most illuminating material that we'll be talking about. First of all, she wrote her autobiography, which talked about her experiences with the course, her spiritual experiences. And both she and Ken Wapnick felt that it needed editing. But when she tried to edit, it just got worse. So Ken Wapnick said, recounting certain events in her life, especially those of a religious nature, and even more specifically, those events surrounding A Course in Miracles, aroused tremendous anxiety in Helen, and her discomfort directly led to an almost fierce over-editing. So what happened was her edited version was worse in many ways than the original, and so she and Ken agreed that she would just stop. So that's one example. The other example is her poems. So she and Ken Wapnick felt the poems needed some editing, and Ken said this: Helen's compulsive editing took over, often at the expense of the poems. So Ken, quote, realized this editing project was a mistake. He said, "I think Helen realized this as well and gladly agreed that we stop." So in both cases, she was uncomfortable with what she was editing and she couldn't stop editing it. And it made it worse. And she had to agree with Ken that she would stop.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, this is exactly what we see in the early chapters. First of all, Ken Wapnick said in Abstinence from Felicity that Helen was very ashamed of the early chapters. He said she was rather ashamed of this. She was always rather ashamed of this early part because it wasn't like the more beautiful poetic passages in the iambic pentameter in the latter part of the text. And so she was uncomfortable. She was ashamed. She kept editing and editing and editing. And I think at least to someone like me, as a course student, I find the material that came out so valuable, unbelievable, priceless. And her editing, therefore, certainly seemed to make things worse. And in this case, though, no one stopped her. And instead, we're taking the same exact patterns that were on display with her autobiography and her poetry that led her and Ken to say, hey, this has to stop. This is making things worse. But now we're saying, but that is perfect guidance. It's absolutely perfect. And okay, maybe we're right. It looks rather suspicious, frankly. But what if we're not right? What if that's that same, compulsive editing basically, changed and removed things that are priceless or would be priceless to students of the course?
And as a result of that, you have a different book because of that kind of compulsive editing. And so if Helen has that trait in her, then again, as writers, we know there's a tinkering that you want to continue to do. And here it is in Ken's own words that Helen had that and continued to tinker with the course until, or at least with her own things, until he had to take it away from her. And so that does build a particular profile of Helen as an editor that's worth paying attention to as a student.
And when you said it next to her remarks in that interview, like, I knew that was a very bad thing to do. It was me trying to insert myself. I had to go back and undo it all. She recognized the principle, even if she couldn't adhere to it in practice.
I know, and that's uncomfortable for us as students, because it's one or the other, right? Like, you want to believe that it was completely guided, that her editing is sacrosanct, or you want to say it was a human process, and look, we all make errors, and let's move on. But if Helen recognized that it was that she wanted to pull herself out of it and said she did, but the what Ken is saying and the work itself is saying tells a different story, that's awkward.
It is awkward. Yeah.
What do we do with that?
We'll just brush over it.
We'll just move on. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, there is also this question about specifics, like when students say Helen was in charge, Helen and Bill were in charge of the editing, and what they wanted in the course is what should be there, and what they didn't want, we just shouldn't be privy to. I mean, there's that attitude out there, and then there's also like the view that Helen and Bill were meant to take out what they took out. They were meant to take out the specifics. I had a conversation with Carol Howe recently, and she said that Bill told her that he felt their guidance, Helen and Bill's guidance, was to take out any specific reference to the world so that you had a book that was eternal and couldn't be placed in any particular time. So what do you make of that? Because Bill evidently considered that to be real guidance.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about that. First of all, the most authoritative instructions for editing are the ones that came from Jesus himself. And what he said in several comments spaced over, an amount of time, was that things that related to their personal lives, that were about them personally or about their personal relationships, shouldn't go in the course because they didn't have what Jesus called the generalizable quality that the course aims at. Any reader couldn't pick that up and read it and think, oh, this is being said to me. Okay, well, taking things out that were about their personal lives or personal relationships, that does not cover everything specific. So for instance, there was this line originally in chapter 12. The analysis of the ego's real motivation is the modern equivalent of the Inquisition. Great line, right? Has nothing to do with Helen and Bill's personal lives whatsoever. But they took it out. And it's the kind of line that once you get used to the editing patterns, is going to come out. Absolutely. Because it refers to something specific in the world. Specific to their lives is vastly different than anything specific in the world.
Yeah, and I think that's where there's a disconnect, because sometimes when students talk about the editing process and they say, well, anything that was too personal to Helen was supposed to come out because it was, as you say, like reading her diary. But that's not entirely true, number one. And number two, that is different than specific examples of things in the world,
Right.
like
Very
the
different.
Inquisition, and so much of the course and so much of the language that was taken out was Jesus using these examples, using this specificity to fill out his teaching. And so we need it in order to take in the message that he's trying to deliver to us. And so when that language, when those specifics are and examples are taken out, it all just feels really cryptic. And so can you speak to that?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's so much that could be said, but he's delivering extremely unfamiliar ideas, never put on paper, never heard by Helen and Bill, of course. And when you encounter new ideas, what do you need? You need examples, you need illustrations, you need them applied to real life situations. You need them ideally compared to the thoughts of already established thinkers. You just need them tacked down to familiar specifics. And that's what he was doing in those early chapters. He was constantly tacking it down, his teaching, to things that they were familiar with. So there was no mistaking what he was saying. And there is a long, long list of issues that course students would be dying to know about that he actually spoke to. You know, one of my favorites is he spoke to Bill's resentments toward his parents. What course student wouldn't want to know how we deal with resentments toward our parents and with the feeling that they didn't value me enough and I've internalized that and it's messed up my life? And we would want to know. There were so many, many things like that, simply because we need that specificity. We don't necessarily need to hear about, you know, Helen's relationship with somebody in her life, with Mike, for instance, but we need reference to specific things in the world.
Mm-hmm. And you have created a list of those specifics. Do you want to just read a couple of them?
I think we don't have time, but I really would encourage people to go and read Appendix 2 in the back of the CE, which is about the need for this edition and how we made it.
Yeah. Well, we've already said there's sex, there's I'll share
Yeah.
some. There's
you're just going to go ahead and do it, huh?
Yeah. There's sex, there's overeating, there's karma, there's Freud and Jung, and so anyway, there's parenting, and so there's just so much there, and those specifics fill out the teachings on those topics, and so
right. Interestingly, one of the early miracle principles was miracles are a gift from parents to children, something like that. Well, Helen and Bill weren't parents. That was expressly not directed at their personal lives, but it's specific: parents, children, something in the world. It was taken out.
Yeah, and what I just read was just is the tip of the iceberg. So there's just a whole lot more. So what about the idea that material was removed because Ken used the word, and I think you referenced this phrase earlier, scribal error, meaning that some of the earlier material didn't fit with some of the later, more lofty and poetic language of the course that Helen was more proud of. And so there is this like rusty channel argument that Helen wasn't hearing correctly. She was, the whole scribing process was new to her. And so we can discount some of what came through in those earlier chapters. And so it shouldn't be there. So what do you have to say about that?
I would say that it's a really convenient argument. I don't see any evidence for that. She said overtly in her autobiography that she assumed the attitude of an editor whose role is to consider only form and disregard content as much as possible. Everything she takes out fits this profile of, on a form level, she didn't want the specifics. She didn't want references to astrology and Freud and Jung and voting machines and karma and sex and all these things. Yeah, on a form level, she just took that stuff out. Okay, we don't have any reason to believe that I know of that she was really concerned with doctrinal purity and she'd take stuff out. Further, Jesus did not speak of those early chapters in this way. First of all, he called them a strong testimony to truth. And he said that there is a sharp ascent upward in thought, and the notes evolve toward unity. But saying they get more lofty and more unified is very different than saying they go from full of error to truth.
Yeah.
Furthermore, he treats them as a needed foundation. He set Helen and Bill the task of reviewing the dictation that had taken place up until the beginning of chapter 3, which was way more than what we think of because so much was taken out. So he treats those early chapters as a crucial foundation rather than as just full of error. There's no indication he thought they were full of error.
I think that's a really important point for students to understand, that Jesus himself acknowledges that the early parts of the course aren't as lofty as the later parts, but that whole language of sharp ascent upwards says it's different than errored, as you said, and we really should really take that in as students. Jesus himself isn't saying errored; he's saying that it gets better. Stick around, but he's not saying that it's untrue. So, okay, so I know we've got to go and we're wrapping up here very, very soon, but just to kind of summarize this for us as students, what does all of this mean for us? How does this editing process directly impact our path?
Well, I think the difference it makes is that there's a lot that could be said about this. There's all those places where the meaning has changed. There's all these discussions where you need him to play out his thought, but they get compressed into maybe half or 40% of their original length. But really, for me, the big picture is about the things that didn't make it in. And what I feel is that he was building a foundation in those early chapters. And that foundation was something he expected Helen and Bill, and presumably students to follow, to take in, and then the rest would be built on top of that. And that foundation was really about miracles. Originally, there was no mistaking what he meant by miracles. I've been saying recently, you could write a book on his instructions for miracle workers in chapter 1 and 2 and somewhat 3. There's voluminous instruction, and there's absolute clarity. And we lost that. Mm-hmm. We lost that foundation. We lost an understanding of what miracles are. And for God's sake, it's a Course in Miracles. That's big. And we just lost so much of the feel of what this is meant to look like as you live it out. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like even though the teaching is there, a lot of our bearings of how do we actually think of this path and think of the living of it and so on, how does it apply to specifics in the world? A lot of that was lost.
Yeah, so often we hear from students who find the CE, they say, oh, I recognize that this was the voice of Jesus, and it feels like a sense of home. And there's a lot of like, oh, there he is. And when you don't have all of his language, then you can't have that feeling. And so you have a sense of disconnect with the book, and it shouldn't be there, because if you had all of his language, then you would feel that from him. So I just want to say,
a lot of the references where he speaks about himself got taken out because a lot of those occurred in the early chapters.
Yeah, and so I just want to say, for anyone who's listening or watching who wants to go deeper, in the complete and annotated edition of the course in Appendix 2, there is more information on how this book was edited in the editing process of the original course. And we also have all of the editing notes for chapters 1 through 4 of the complete and annotated edition on the Circle's website, circleofa.org, under the course. And so I just want to say very, very briefly, for those who are new to the CE and new to the Circle in general, that this version of the course was created over a period of 12 years by Robert and a team here at the Circle, who went back to the original notes, to Helen's original notes, and transcribed them all and created a new version of the course from scratch, one that wasn't beholden to anyone's editing process, but beholden to the words themselves. And so that's, do you want to say anything about the process of creating the CE, Robert?
I don't think we really have time.
Okay. All right. Go ahead.
I think the big punchline for me is that, Helen's editing looks in every way, it looks like a human endeavor. She's a good editor. I think she had her tendencies and biases and so on that were drawbacks, but there's no reason to think this is editing from beyond the human. And so in my mind, I've always thought, okay, well, Helen had these two roles. One was scribe, and we thought that was like the sum total of her role. Turns out she had this additional role, which has come to light in recent years, of editor. And from my standpoint, I absolutely honor her role as scribe. As editor, she was just another human editor, and she didn't do a perfect job. And there were some things that were lost in the process. It was a good faith effort, but it was a human effort. And so for me, I honor her role as scribe because ultimately what we have to honor and be loyal to is Jesus and his words. We need to honor the people on the human side, Helen, Bill, Ken, Judy, but ultimately we need to honor Jesus.
Yeah, really, that's what it's all about at the end of the day, is the loyalty here to the words, to Jesus's words, or is the loyalty to Helen's editing process? And I'm with you, Robert. I hold Helen in such fondness and esteem for her role as scribe. I mean, if I would give anything to hear the voice of Jesus as clearly as she did. And I do agree with you that this was a monumental task that she undertook, and it was a good faith effort, and we should honor that. We should celebrate that and really respect it. And then there's this other side, right? Is Helen as editor, and Helen as editor is different than Helen as scribe. And Helen as editor was, as Ken was saying, compulsive and neurotic and concerned about what should appear in the course and what shouldn't, when that's really not her decision to make, right? Like, if Jesus wants sex in his book, Jesus will put sex in his book. And
he even answered directly her concerns about that.
Right, because she said, I didn't intend to write a book on, God knows I didn't intend to write a book on sex. And he says, God, he does indeed. Yeah. So even that was addressed, like Jesus answered her. And so anyway, I just, as course students, I think all of us, for the big punchline here is to consider holding Helen in these two places, honoring as scribe, but recognizing the fallibility of anyone as human editor. And so make your decisions about your course study from there. Okay.
Okay.
I know we got to go. So thank you guys so much for staying with us. We really appreciate it. And we will see you next time. Bye for now.